A lot of why it has become so special and a favorite of so many people in the business because of its uncompromising stance at the approach of the characters towards art. Backstage life or the theater, it's not that important. It's what they're striving for. And also, at times, how it could be fulfilling and at times how it could be destructive. It encourages this in creative people. It really does encourage it. I know Brian De Palma was the first film. That's the film that made him want to become a filmmaker. Many people that I know, the first film they can remember seeing because it was so vivid.
My name's Ian Christie, and that was Martin Scorsese speaking for all those who found The Red Shoes an inspiration. On this commentary, you'll also be hearing from the film's stars, Moira Shearer and Marius Goring, and from its cinematographer, Jack Cardiff, and the composer, Brian Easdale. What first drew Scorsese to the film?
One of the things that fascinated me about The Red Shoes and most of the Paul Pressburger films was the palette, the use of color in their films, where color took on an even more powerful, dramatic impact. Color became almost a character, and especially The Red Shoes, well, even in the title, The Red Shoes. I don't think I'd ever seen up to that point, and I saw a lot of color films up to that point, anything so powerful as a use of color. Powerful and yet subtle at times. It was so strong, I remember being washed with the color, almost like a three-dimensional effect, seeing it on a big screen in nitrate print projected at that time. Something very special about the way sets were lit, and even to the sense of the performers' eyes, the way the eyes looked, and especially the painted faces of the ballet dancers.
It's colour, rich, sensuous, three-strip Technicolor, which was still a novelty at this time, that is at the heart of The Red Shoes, just as it had already been in 3 of Powell and Pressburger's previous films, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, A Matter of Life and Death, and, just a year earlier, Black Narcissus, another film with colour in its title, where the red of a lipstick had spelt danger and ultimately disaster, and which had won its cameraman an Academy Award. That cameraman was Jack Cardiff, who was then the leading colour cinematographer in Britain and ready for any challenge the Archers could give him.
I was working on Black Narcissus, on the last days of Black Narcissus, and Michael Powell asked me what I thought of ballet. And I said very foolishly, not much, all those sissies prancing about. And Michael said, "Have you ever seen a ballet?" And I grinned a touche and said, no, I hadn't. I admitted I hadn't ever seen a ballet in my life. So Michael told me briskly, well, you've got a lot of catching up to do, and you're going to have tickets to go and see ballet almost every night. And I said, oh, my God, it's a chore having to go and see all these ballets. But, of course, I went and I grew in love with ballet, and I became a complete ballettoman within a week.
The audiences that Jack Cardiff joined for his crash course in ballet in 1947 were hungry for art and entertainment, at a time when almost everything else in Britain still seemed to be rationed. The war had stimulated a new interest in the arts, but peacetime was proving a tougher challenge. The crusading Labour government created a National Arts Council in 1946, with the famous economist Maynard Keynes in charge, and Keynes just happened to be a ballet enthusiast. He was able to help the 2 determined ladies who had kept ballet alive in Britain. Marie Rombert's company became a training ground for new talent, and in 1946, the same year that Lincoln Kirstein and Balanchine established the New York City Ballet, Ninette de Valois found a permanent home for her Sadler's Wells company, soon to become the Royal Ballet, here at the historic Royal Opera House in Covent Garden. Both the British and the Americans still suffered from an inferiority complex. They looked to Russia as the font of modern dance, and especially to the legacy of Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. Powell's insistence on having real dancers for The Red Shoes led him to the legendary Leonid Massine, who had been Diaghilev's ballet master, and is here doing the same job in Lermontov's fictitious company.
A lot of the shots were made actually at Covent Garden because it's a sort of set. Certainly in our budget at the time we couldn't possibly build. We had the whole interior of the theatre. We photographed the real thing. You'll see some strange marks. It looks like something's wrong with the negative or the picture. And what it is the peephole. Now, you see that cellophane. And it's surprising the people who think that there's something wrong with the picture there because it's just like a lot of shiny dots. In fact, it is a circular piece of cellophane that is there on the curtain, in the real thing,
The trappings are real, but realism wasn't the Archers' aim. Instead, they used this banter between ballet enthusiasts, known at the time as balletomanes, and music students to establish the conflict between pure music and the impure carnival of ballet, which runs through the whole film. Marius Goring played the young composer who's about to leave his ivory tower and join the carnival.
This thing is half a fairy tale and half reality. And I think that was the real thing about the whole film. Obviously, when the thing starts, and there you are down in Covent Garden, and there's ballet on, that is a world of make-believe, but a very, very nice one to be in. And my goodness, an awful lot of work goes into it from the people who are the dancers and all that. But then suddenly comes this thing in which you do jump into reality. Because the great awful appearance of Diaghilev. It wasn't really Diaghilev, of course, but it was based on Diaghilev.
The impresario Lermontov was loosely based on the legendary Diaghilev, and the Archers shared with Diaghilev a passion for finding the very best collaborators. Like him, they took music very seriously. They'd commissioned Vaughan Williams, one of the most famous English composers, to write for an earlier film. Now they were giving another chance to the unknown young Brian Easdale, who'd already distinguished himself on Black Narcissus, and who, unlike Jack Cardiff, was already a ballet enthusiast.
I'd always been something of a balletomane. I'd seen Diaghilev's Russian ballet and been to the Rambert Ballet, and there was at that time, the Royal Ballet, I think. I got a free pass to stand in the wings at Covent Garden for Tchaikovsky's The Sleeping Beauty, and in which there's the Rose Adagio. Now, in the Red Shoes, there's a sequence of a very slow pas de deux, which Maura Shearer danced with Robert Helpman. And I found the Tchaikovsky Rose Adagio very good as a stimulant, all this part of the ballet. I also used a chorale, which comes at the end in the last scene, a chorale which I found in a book that had been given me by a clergyman friend of mine many years ago, the Lutheran hymns. I used this chorale in that final sequence of the girls' dance with the demon shoemaker.
So how did Powell and Pressburger come to be making a film set in the rarefied world of ballet? The origins of the project lay in a script that Pressburger had written for Alexander Korda in 1937, intended to star Korda's discovery, Merle Oberon. She wasn't a dancer, but the idea of showing off her beauty in a ballet seemed to have appealed to her future husband. By the time Pressburger came to the project, several scripts had already been submitted and rejected. Pressburger accepted Korda's suggestion that the central theme of the film, or at least its ballet, would be Hans Christian Andersen's The Red Shoes, apparently a popular story in the two men's native Hungary. More importantly, Pressburger installed himself at Covent Garden to observe the birth of a ballet. The work in question was based on the life of Paganini and was being created by Mikhail Fokine with Diaghilev's company, the Ballet Russe, still touring after their founder's death. It was this pre-war research that gave Pressburger all the essentials of his portrait of one of the Russian ballet troupes. Powell also had a link with the world of the Ballet Russe. He had spent several formative years in the south of France in the mid-20s, working for Rex Ingram at the Victorine studio in Nice, and it was there he'd met many artists and members of the émigré Russian community. He knew Monte Carlo, where Diaghilev had based himself, and could picture how an international company would live and work there while creating a new ballet. The idea of buying back the script from Korda occurred to Powell and Pressburger some time before they finally did it in mid-1946. As the project became a reality after the heady technical ambition of A Matter of Life and Death and Black Narcissus, they decided that what would make it exceptional was to have at its center a real ballet, specially created for the film. Not just one that could be glimpsed from the wings, but a complete work in its own right. How long could they risk? Emmerich thought 10 minutes, but Michael demanded 20. Eventually they compromised on 15 minutes, longer than had ever been accommodated in any narrative film before. From this followed two more important decisions: that the performers must be real dancers, since doubles would be impossible for such a large proportion of the total film, and that the central ballet would be seen not from the audience's point of view, but in a new, subjective way, as if through the dancer's imagination. To realise these ambitious plans would mean going far beyond normal production planning. First, they had to find a dancer for the leading part who could also act. Powell gave the credit for suggesting Moira Shearer to Stuart Granger, who advised him to go and see her in Robert Helpman's production of Miracle in the Gaubles. This was a controversial attempt to create a modern tragedy set in the slums of Glasgow, with music by Arthur Bliss. Powell was immediately convinced, but would Miss Shearer want to do it? They would have to recruit many more dancers and all the backstage personnel, and for this they would need to convince the leading names in ballet that they were serious. And to create the ballet itself, they would need artists of real ability, a composer, a designer, and a choreographer who could think in terms of film. Clearly, the Red Shoes was going to mean many changes for the Archers, which Powell and Pressburger thought of more as a family than merely a production company. In the film, Lady Neston has baited a trap to bring her ward, Vicky, to the attention of the great Lermontov. I asked Marius Goring about the opulence of her after-theatre party. Wasn't it a bit overdone?
I think people did dress exactly like that at the time they were doing it. You had to have full evening stuff with white waistcoat and everything. You wouldn't be allowed in. Money was there all over the place after the war.
Lady Neston's reception is to enable Vicky to spring an audition on Lermontov. In reality, the filmmakers had a long struggle to persuade Moira Shearer to risk interrupting her promising ballet career.
It was 1946, and I had just started to dance some of the big classics at Covent Garden, and Princess Aurora and Sleeping Beauty was the first one. And that, for a classical dancer, sort of just beginning in the sort of big time, is quite a part. It's extremely difficult. So I just sort of got through that without disgracing anybody, and was just beginning to sort of settle into it when this man, bald-headed man, with a large script tucked under his arm, came to the dressing room and said, very grandly, that he thought I would be the very person for this great film. I remember him saying that particularly, this great film he was going to make. And it was about the ballet, of course, and so on. And so I said, well, you know, may I read the thing? And of course, my dear, and all that. And he went away, leaving this fat script. And I took it home and I read it. And forgive me, but I thought it was absolutely awful. It was just, to me, sheer woman's magazine. The sort of idea that people have of the glamorous life of a ballet company, you know, and I just thought, oh, heavens no, this is not for me. And so then he was back quite soon afterwards, and I said, most kind of you, etc., but really, no. And he was frightfully put out, and he went on, and he went on and on, and I tried to be more firm. Well, then he went away, but he was back, and he was back, and he was back. And I suppose, but not known to me, that he was also bothering Ninette de Valois, the director of the company, and various other people. I don't know how many times he sort of tackled me about it, and I kept to what I said, because I just wanted to stay at Covent Garden on my £10 a week and get on with what I was doing. And he did go away for, I suppose, about a year. I forgot all about him and the whole thing. And I did Swan Lake, and I did one at Coppelio and one or two of the others, and was just working away like mad in the theatre. And then he was back. And he said he hadn't found anybody else. Had I reconsidered it? And then he said, I now have Leonid Myasin, who will be in the film, and also Robert Helpman, whom, of course, I worked with all the time. So this made a bit of a difference to me, because I suddenly thought, well, at least he's got people who really know about the ballet, and perhaps this will make a slight difference. But it still didn't change my determination not to do it. And then suddenly, one day, to my absolute amazement, I was summoned to de Valois' office. Now, the only time somebody like me was ever summoned to the office was to stand on the mat and be blown up for some misdemeanor, whatever it was. So I thought, oh, God, what have I done? And I went in, and to my amazement, she said, oh, dear, sit down, dear. Well, one never was asked to sit down. And she said, now, look, dear, we're absolutely sick of this man hanging round this theatre, being an absolute bore to us all. For God's sake, she said, and these are her actual words, for God's sake, do this film, get it off your chest and off ours, because we can't stand it anymore. And I looked at her in absolute amazement, because I thought she would be the one person who would say, don't touch the movies or anything so, disgusting and so on. And not a bit of it. There she was, literally almost pushing me into it. And then I did say to her, wisely, I think, although I was awfully stupid in those days and didn't think ahead, but I did say on this occasion, can I come straight back to the company after the filming is over and go, I remember saying, and go on as if nothing's happened? And she said, of course, dear, absolutely, of course. Alas, it wasn't quite like that, of course, because she did then look at me in a different way.
Boris Lermontov also looks at Victoria Page differently after their talk, though she hasn't yet made as much impression as she hopes. And on the morning after the Heart of Fire premiere, its true composer also has business with Lermontov. Critics of The Red Shoes often accuse it of being simplistic and rather starry-eyed. They could also point to its highly symmetrical structure. Vicky and Julian both enter Lermontov's charmed circle at the same time as a result of attending the same performance. But there's nothing accidental about this symmetry. In fact, it's essential to make us accept the film's allegory of artistic creation, how it requires seduction, sacrifice, and luck. Here we're dealing with seduction. By all accounts, the two figures on whom Lermontov is based, Diaghilev and the producer Alexander Korda, were both accomplished seducers. They both had the ability to draw diverse people into their circle, to bend them to their purposes. In this opening scene between Lermontov and Julian, we see the skills of the seducer at work. And there must surely be a lot of Korda in this portrait of the impresario. Korda knew the value of a conspicuous display of wealth and sophistication. He lived in an exclusive hotel suite, dined at only the best restaurants, and ran his affairs in a deliberately aristocratic style. It flattered his guests and often won them over against their better judgment, as was about to happen with Powell and Pressburger after The Red Shoes. Here, young Julian is hooked by Lermontov's careful blend of aloofness and flattery. In the original pre-war script, the composer was a working-class rebel who remained suspicious of the luxury world of ballet. There's a little of this left in Marius Goring's Julian, but mainly we sense that, as a budding composer, he's doubtful about how ballet treats music as a means to an end, rather than as an art in its own right. It's an old controversy, fueled by the number of classic 19th century ballets that have second-rate scores, often cobbled together from pre-existing material. And then there's a need to subordinate the music to choreographers' and dancers' needs. We'll hear more about that when Julian is conducting. And ultimately, the feeling that narrative ballet music somehow isn't serious, even though it was Diaghilev's championing of contemporary composers that made both his and their reputations. All of this we can imagine to be lying between Lermontov and Julian as they warily judge each other. The impresario is constantly looking for new talent that he can sign up and exploit. There's something predatory about him. He's a collector of talent and people, maybe even of their souls. And Walbrook is brilliantly diabolic, which is perhaps surprising in view of the roles that he'd previously played for the Archers. Peter, the Hutterite leader in the 49th Parallel, and Theo, the good German in Colonel Blimp, were both warm, sympathetic characters, spokesmen for reason and tolerance. But here he's a cynical sophisticate, riveting, yet cold and possibly dangerous.
I suppose Walbrook was ideal casting. As I said, I think he had no physical resemblance to Diaghilev. But, of course, he's much better looking, and it's more cinema, more box office, I suppose. He certainly had charisma, and he was able to put over very easily that he was quite a character and someone very difficult to be with.
Walbrook would soon use his new persona in Max Offel's La Ronde, where he's the cynical master of ceremonies in turn-of-the-century Vienna. And in 1955 he would reprise it again in The Archers' O Rosalinda. In fact, this modern dress version of Strauss's Die Fledermaus could be seen as the final part of a loose musical trilogy, along with Red Shoes and The Tales of Hoffmann. It has wonderfully Baroque studio settings and costumes by Hein Heckroth, and Ludmilla Cherina gets a bigger role. But its main glory is Walbrook's cynical playboy who stage manages parties and practical jokes and keeps his cool while all around are losing theirs. He's an impresario again, though now it's of fun instead of art. But now Julian is about to enter the strange world of ballet, and until recently Covent Garden Theatre stood incongruously in the midst of London's vegetable and flower market.
This is Covent Garden. That's the flower place, but the next door, the big building with the columns, that is the old original Covent Garden. And we tied in these exteriors, which were real, of course, taken with our studio sets. This is real, but then we'll cut inside in a minute to a set. And it's just the marriage of the two things, the set and the real thing.
The stage doorkeeper is played by Jerry Verno, who appeared in 2 of the first comedy thrillers that Powell directed in the early 30s. Here, he's a comic foil to the real ballet star, Ludmilla Cherina, who was a prima ballerina of the Monte Carlo Ballet when Powell spotted her acting in a 1946 French film, A Lover's Return. Jack Cardiff still remembers her enthusiastic personality.
And Cherina?
Yes.
Ludmilla Cherina, she was extremely talented, and of course she had a secondary part. She was absolutely marvelous to work with. And she was married to Edmond Auderon, who was also a ballet dancer. I was saying how I admired Romeo and Juliet. To my amazement, they said, "Would you like us to do it for you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "Well, in your house." I had a very large drawing room. It was about, I think it was about 40 feet long. They actually performed the ballet in my drawing room to a gramophone record. And it was fascinating. I mean, normally if you watch, even from the most expensive box in Covent Garden, you couldn't have got closer. I mean, they were literally buzzing 6 inches away from me sometimes, panting and whatever, and the terrific energy. And here I was watching this wonderful, and they danced it beautifully. That was something that was unusual, obviously. Absolutely wonderful.
As Cherina leads Julian through the backstage labyrinth, there's a build-up of expectation. Like him, we're keen to discover what mysteries lie behind the public spectacle, and Powell and Pressburger were determined to show the hard work that ballet's seeming elegance requires, which Emmerich had seen for himself during his research at Covent Garden. But of course, it's still glamorous, especially to the outsider, and The Red Shoes is above all an initiation into the act of creation, which is why it has inspired so many, and not only future dancers. It's not aiming at realism, for these are realms of myth. And the myth in question is that of the Russian ballet, which is the crucible of so much that we still call modern art. There's only one real Russian in the Lermontov company, Massin, but its principal dancer, Ivan Boleslavsky, is certainly meant to be Russian. At any rate, Boleslavsky is played by Robert Helpmann, who was a key figure in establishing the Red Shoes' ballet credibility. Helpmann had left his native Australia to join Pavlova's touring company, and then settled in Britain in the 30s, where he became Sadler's Wells' principal dancer, before starting in the 40s to branch out into choreography and dramatic acting. Moira Shearer was certainly impressed that Helpmann had joined the Red Shoes, although she had some reservations about his strictly technical abilities.
Bobby wasn't really a very good choreographer, which I'm sure I can say that with impunity because everyone sort of knows that. If this was not his, mime was Bobby's thing. He wasn't a particularly good dancer, and, well, you can have your own view about the way he acted. He was certainly a great character when he acted. He was always very much himself with those mad cod eyes, and so on. But his choreography was perfectly adequate. Bobby did a very sort of straightforward, good job on the choreography. He was a very wicked man, if I may put it like that, with a marvellous, maliciously funny tongue. Everybody caught it at some time. No one was exempt from the boot going right through you and out the other side, but in a very amusing way. One just had to be able to take it.
Helpmann may not have been a great dancer, but he was a catalyst, an experimenter, and a surprisingly magnetic personality on screen. He'd already played a vivid cameo for the Archers in One of Our Aircraft is Missing, and 3 years after The Red Shoes, he would play the important multiple role of Count Lindsdorf in The Tales of Hoffmann, bringing all his dance and mime skills to the different manifestations of this sinister character. This backstage scene is the first of several that show an ideal artistic community, which was something especially dear to Powell, although it shouldn't be forgotten that Pressburger had started his film career in the late 20s at the UFA studio in Berlin, which was then considered the most sophisticated in the world. But it was Powell who remained fascinated by the idea of collective creation. He'd first experienced it as a young man in the mid-20s when he was suddenly dropped into the exotic Riviera world of Rex Ingram's Hollywood company based at Nice, where artists and characters of all kinds would cluster around, drawn to the most modern art of all, the movies. And at the end of his career, in the early 80s, Powell was happy to be a part of Francis Coppola's short-lived Zoetrope Studio, a latter-day experiment in collective filmmaking. Between these two experiences, both Powell and Pressburger enjoyed the raffish artistic atmosphere of Korda's circle, and even under Arthur Rank's more sober patronage, there was the experiment known as Independent Frame to inspire Powell in the mid-40s. This was an ambitious attempt to link up all the modern film studios' special effects processes in a coherent way which would allow films to be made more quickly and flexibly. It was an idea far ahead of its time and soon abandoned, but Powell had taken the lead among British filmmakers in championing a way of working that would put more creative responsibility into the hands of craftsmen and technicians. Over the 15 or so years of the Archers, Powell and Pressburger ran their company almost like a craft guild or an old-fashioned family business. Apprentices and juniors started at the bottom and were encouraged to work their way up in all departments. Jack Cardiff had been a camera assistant on Colonel Blimp before being entrusted with the challenge of A Matter of Life and Death. And soon his assistant, Chris Challis, would become a full cinematographer. So we should see this ballet company at work not only as a celebration of the touring ballet and opera companies which flourished in the early years of the century, but also as a surrogate for the ideal film company which the Archers tried to be. For them, there was a natural equation between the film studio and the rehearsal stage. Jack Cardiff remembers how Moira Shearer reacted to the world of filmmaking.
Moira was the antithesis to a big movie star. I mean, she was so down to earth and natural. There was no attempt to be the great star. She was marvelous to work with. I mean, she came up to my operator and myself, my operator Chris Challis and myself, one day and said, "Would you like me to get you some tea?" I mean, no star had ever done that in my life. She was very sure in what she was doing. And I remember that I knew Russell Flint, the painter at the time, and I introduced her to him, and he did several paintings. But she was quite critical of herself, and it was Scott against Scott, you know, because Flint was Scott, and she would say, "Sir William, I don't think you've got my foot right, you know, and it's not quite like that." And so she was quite critical sometimes. But on the film, she worked very hard indeed.
Both Julian and Vicky have to undergo these rites of passage as mere novices among the giants. And a key feature of the ballet profession becomes an important motif in the film, the discipline of everyone attending class and exercising at the bar. Here, at least, the extras and the stars are on an equal footing.
I think that will do. Thank you, gentlemen. The brass could do with your attention, Craster. Tomorrow.
Although Marius Goring could give a convincing impression of playing what are supposed to be his own compositions on the piano, conducting an orchestra was another matter. He remembers panicking when Powell insisted that he come up with some typical conductor's business for this scene, until he realized he could get it from Sir Thomas Beecham himself. So Goring learned how to correct a player's wrong note with authority, although Pressburger was shocked by his impersonation of Beecham's notorious sarcasm.
One or two things I really must put right.
Michael had just said to me, this next scene that comes, one wants to get them going. I then came and I said, well, this is really very difficult. He said, don't talk. You've got half an hour, because that's where we're going to start turning. Beecham was rehearsing in the studio, just along passage. I went in. He was talking to the second cello. And he said, excuse me, but John, was that B or B flat? He said, oh, well, it's B flat here, sir. Yes, it does make a difference, doesn't it? So I said, that's got it. So I went over to the first violin and I said, look, we want to shoot something. Do you think you could do it? He said, yes, but we haven't got any music here. All right, I'll ask them. They all said, yes, of course we can. I'm sure we can do it. So we came in, and Mickey was there, and then all the other actors, like in the great Gregor, dear Emmerich. who's crying with you. He said, "Oh, God, I could talk to musicians like that." What? How terrible to make them unhappy. But it was such a marvellous, it was so fun when we did the whole thing.
Sir Thomas Beecham was probably the most famous conductor in Britain when Brian Easdale invited him to conduct the Red Shoes Ballet, and his involvement brought considerable prestige to the film. By an odd coincidence, it was Beecham's father, Sir Joseph, who had first brought Diaghilev to Britain in 1913 for an historic season of Russian opera and ballet at Covent Garden. With the money inherited from his family's patent medicine business, Thomas enjoyed a spectacular career in the years between the wars. He founded two of London's great orchestras and championed the cause of many neglected composers, especially Delius. Beecham also cut quite a dash in society. He was involved in various divorce scandals and had a notoriously caustic wit. I think we can assume that Livy's sarcasm and the fact that he's shown as a breezy baronet are a direct tribute to Sir Thomas's most famous attributes. Beecham's Red Shoes experience led him to suggest to the Archers a full-scale film of the Tales of Hoffmann just 3 years later, which he would conduct himself. There's even a shot of him at the end, putting down his baton after the last chord, followed by a typically irreverent Archer's gag. The score is stamped "Made in Britain." It's a joke, but one with a point. Powell and Pressburger understood only too well the curious cultural ambivalence of Britain, never quite comfortable with the seriousness of much European art. In this, they were following directly in the footsteps of Beecham, who'd always believed in sugaring the pill of classical music. He used to include popular tidbits in his concerts, which he called lollipops. Wartime concerts and performances for troops had already done a lot to break down the pre-war elitism of opera and ballet in Britain. But whether this new appeal would continue was still an open question in 1947, and we're often reminded of Vicky's privileged background. Powell and Pressburger were unabashed popularizers. They wanted to bring the message of art to the widest possible audience without compromising its quality. As Powell said, "We had all been told for 10 years to go out and die for freedom and democracy. But now that the war was over, the Red Shoes told everyone to go out and die for art."
How are you, madame?
How are you?
Hello, Peter. I hope we haven't kept you...
But in the late 40s, the only contact with ballet that most people in Britain would have had was through the Ballet Rambert. Marie Rambert's company toured throughout Britain, and in London it appeared not at Covent Garden, but at the tiny Mercury Theatre. In a moment you'll see another little in-joke when Beecham's Royal Philharmonic Orchestra is billed on the poster, but it turns out to be only on gramophone records. Jack Cardiff vouches for the authenticity of this sequence.
This is the actual site of Ballet Rambert, and it's a tiny place, very tiny, and I had a kind of love for this place because it's so real. You know, we shot actually in the place, and it's a tiny stage.
The Mercury Theatre is the smallest stage we see in the film, and coming after Covent Garden, it stands as a benchmark. This is ballet stripped down to basics, a bare stage, a simple backdrop with gramophone music. And just because it is so plain, it turns out to be surprisingly effective on film, less like theatre and more like the abstract space of a studio. And it's also where we get the first inkling of what this film plans to do.
The zip pans that you see here, I have a temptation to say it was my idea because I did suggest a lot of those things, but it probably was Michael's after all. It was a series of zip pans which was unusual because it seemed to suggest itself, didn't it? If she's doing these pirouettes, and the whole art of the pirouette is the stop, isn't it?
Those zip pans and blurs are the first sign we get of the film's intention to give us a dancer's point of view. And in fact, this sequence marks the last time that we see any audience in the film. From here on, we're entirely within the stage world in all the performances we see. That lady we see at the back of the theatre is Marie Rambert herself, making a cameo appearance. She, at any rate, didn't have the same hostility to cinema as her contemporary Ninette de Valois, though I wonder what she thought about that gramophone changeover gag. Everything we've seen in this Mercury Theatre sequence contributes powerfully to an understanding of the ballet world. How Vicky can be a humble temporary member of Lermontov's Corps de Ballet and yet a star of the Ballet Rambert, and how even the aloof Lermontov goes talent spotting. Like Vicky, Maurice Shearer found it strange to be working closely with a living dance legend.
Leonid Myasin I had known of since I suppose the age of 10, and I'd seen him in the theatre before the war. I was taken to performances, when we were in London. I had a tremendous admiration for, knew all his ballets and so on. When he came in 1946, yes, he came to us to do these two revivals of two of his great ballets, which he'd choreographed for Diaghilev. I was absolutely thrilled to be in them, and especially to be the other can-can dancer with him in Booty Fantasque, although I was too tall, really, for him. An awful lot of people I've heard, young, baby ballerinas, Baronova, Tumanova, Rybushinska, who were with Debazil's company. There was Danilova, who was older. But all of them I have read since and heard them being interviewed saying, oh, we were terrified of him. We felt we couldn't speak to him, and he never spoke to us, and so on. I somehow just hit the right point with him, and I found him wonderfully funny, in a very dry, quiet, sinister way sometimes. We got on like a house on fire, and it was so wonderful when we found ourselves going to make this movie together, because when we got back after the location time in Monte Carlo, and we were at Pinewood at the end of the long day's shooting, and in the car, we were both absolutely exhausted after a 17-hour day, but he would tell me, and I would draw him out, he would tell me wonderful, very wicked stories about the Diaghilev company, and what he'd done, and what Diaghilev had done, and this and that.
The Red Shoes unit stopped in Paris on the way to Monte Carlo to film this short, though impressive sequence at the Opéra Garnier. Powell described how, after shooting the exteriors, they all sat down to a slap-up French lunch, which must have been a rare treat after the years of wartime food rationing that Britain had endured. Here the company is rehearsing Giselle, and this sequence suggests Jack Cardiff must have added Degas to his visual references. It's one of the most beautiful ballet images of the film.
This is the real interior of the Opera House at Paris. That was real, and the exterior real, of course. And that's real, you see. That's quite a set, isn't it? It's a magnificent place. We did the whole sequence there. We didn't use any studio stuff on this. Of course, looking back on it, I think Michael was one of the first, not the very first, but he, in those days, even then, they had a tendency to shoot everything in a studio, didn't they? This was sort of away from it all, real stuff.
I get married.
The first to congratulate Boronskaya is Ratov, Lermontov's designer, a fictitious amalgam of the many distinguished painters who worked for Diaghilev. These included the Russians, Roerich and Larionov, but also French painters like Picasso and Derain, who in fact had found their first sympathetic patrons in pre-revolutionary Russia. To play Ratov, Powell reached back into cinema history for the German actor Albert Bassermann, who was at this time living in America. Bassermann belonged to the very first generation of actors who'd left the security of the theatre to throw in their lot with cinema. He'd acted for Reinhardt on stage, and then for Lubitsch, and later for Sternberg in Hollywood. Here, as Lermontov's oldest and most trusted colleague, he supplies the human warmth that's conspicuously missing from his icy master.
He has no heart, that man.
We've seen just how ruthless Lermontov can be with the puppets who realize his vision. Instead of saying anything to Boronskaya, he just left, which tells her exactly where she now stands with him. Nowhere. It's a chilling indication of what happens to anyone who crosses Lermontov, and in this first of several scenes where we're alone with him, we have time to feel his brooding disapproval and to sense him making new plans. Not surprisingly, this ruthlessness in pursuit of his vision is something a filmmaker can appreciate, perhaps even sneakily admire, now that so many decisions are taken by committee. Martin Scorsese deals with obsessive characters in many of his own movies, and he has long been fascinated by the figure of Lermontov.
Krasta, I have a job for you.
In terms of Lermontov, I liked his obsessive quality and how he controlled the group and how he had a vision which he put onto the stage. Walbrook, to me, was a fascinating character because of his obsessive quality and how it drove him and people he loved to destruction. I thought that was interesting. It's the old story, really. The villain is always more interesting than the hero at times. The hero has to really be an archetype in a way, like a Western. It's a different kind of thing. But here, this was quite a unique character that I'd never seen anything like before.
As Lermontov starts to tell the story of the ballet, his voice is drowned by the music that will later accompany it. The justification we're given by this dreamy close-up of Julian is that he's inspired. So it's as if we're getting an audio flash forward or point of view. Composing The Red Shoes will be a turning point in his life. It'll bring him fame, happiness, and tragedy. And all this is anticipated in that subjective burst of music. It's one of the many devices used to overcome what Powell felt was a weakness of Pressburger's original pre-war script. The viewpoint of the storyteller had been outside the story. What the Archers had to do in 1947, after their breakthrough into a new kind of narrative with Blimp, was to find a more compelling way of telling what would have been a rather trite tale of life imitating art. The solution turned out to be showing it from Lermontov's point of view. As he tells the Red Shoes story to Julian, he caresses a strange fetishistic statue. From Powell and Pressburger's later novel, we discover that it's actually a cast of Pavlova's foot, a relic of the most famous of all Russian dancers. But here it just serves to emphasize his perverse, passionate identification with the Red Shoes as an allegory of dance itself. For Lermontov, it's something that transcends mere ballet stories and human dancers. They're just excuses, instruments, puppets, who realize a vision that he has. And it's all there in this urgent telling of the Red Shoes story. The shoes dance the girl, they are never tired. Life rushes by, love rushes by, in the end she dies. At the beginning of the scene, Lermontov picked up Julian's phrase about orchestra coaching not being a young composer's dream. What he's offering in the Red Shoes will be that dream, even if it becomes a nightmare. On film, of course, ballet can have a dreamlike quality, which it can never have on stage, and so it's understandable that dancers should be suspicious about film making it all look too easy. But the lack of physicality on screen has its own quality and can produce images that are more powerful than either staged ballet or ordinary dramatic film. Because they're mute and linked closely with music, they have an intensity that can tap directly into unconscious associations. In fact, dance film can be the nearest thing to a visible language of the unconscious. So naturally, realism takes a back seat, as Martin Scorsese believes it has to.
I don't know if it's realistic. I don't know backstage ballet. I have no idea if Maurice Shira feels that it's not realistic. Other people feel that it wasn't meant to be realistic. I tend to agree with the latter because you get a situation where it's real about style. It's all about style. It has to do, I think, with the same mentality and the same creative approach that makes the Ballet of the Red Shoes itself be more about what goes on inside the mind of the dancer than the actual dancing itself. It's all stylized in terms of color, camera movement, composition, and editing to create an impression of a world. Not the world itself, but an impression of it.
For this vital moment when life and art begin to blur, it's important that we see Lermontov as a magician, not as his normal suave self. Powell's brilliant solution is to put him on stage, standing in the wings, which allows him to be lit in a new, dramatic way. Lermontov has become a character himself in the psychodrama of the Red Shoes that's developing in front of our eyes out of a conventional backstage story of travel, ambition, and heartache. Walbrook's amazing authority on screen was probably helped by his aloofness off-screen. He wore dark glasses constantly, at a time when these were hardly normal fashion accessories, and Maurice Shira remembers that he never mixed with the other actors, even when they were on location together.
He would be always in his caravan. There were always these glasses. Everything was taken to his caravan and so on. He ate by himself. He arrived and he left in some limousine, I don't know. We never really saw him. He would be called by his own particular dresser or whoever, and he would appear, and he certainly knew his lines and everything like that, but there would be no question of sort of working with anybody else. He never worked with one. He just did what he did, and then we round him, you see, and fit it in as best we could. There was a great moment, yes, because Marius and I were both put into the Hôtel de Paris, rightfully grand, you know, this huge entrance and so on, in the square at Monte Carlo. And of course Anton was already ensconced in the suite somewhere up above. But we did meet at the end of the day sometimes in the restaurant. And by this time the grandees had had their dinner at correct times and we were at all the wrong times. So we had it more or less to ourselves. But Anton would sit by himself and Marius and me would be sort of carrying on in a corner somewhere and giggling a lot, which I think he thought frightfully bad form. But he did pass by our table on one evening and say, "So wonderful, but this is not our world." And then he disappeared. And we went progress and we stuffed napkins in our mouths as she went by. Because, I mean, what a thing to say, you know. And there we were, all working together in the same thing. Crazy man.
The Red Shoes started shooting in Monte Carlo in the summer of 1947. It was here that Diaghilev had spent each winter between his tours, and for his fictional counterpart, Lermontov, as much as for the Archers, it was an ideal place to create a modern fairy tale. For most of the cast and crew, nowhere could have been more exotic, coming from the privations of post-war Britain. But this was familiar ground to Powell. His father had owned a hotel nearby since just after the First World War, and he had visited every year before the war. It was a magical place, and Powell was determined to avoid the tourist stereotypes and show the real enchanted Riviera.
Michael Powell had a Bentley out there, an open tourer Bentley, which he used to go out with the few sort of senior technicians to look for locations, and that was quite a thrill to go around the Corniche in an open Bentley, go very fast, as Michael used to drive.
That's the one bit of the film I absolutely love. That was a lovely, lovely sequence, and very imaginative, I thought. Rather like Cocteau. Same sort of idea. That was fun to do. Although it was very odd. You know, it was done with me sitting on a sawn-off back of a lorry, and the chains went to the other sawn-off back of the lorry with the camera on it. They stuck a bit of, you know, as if the back of the car was there. But my legs were dangling. And every now and then I thought I was going to slip down and underneath. And there was the lorry in front sort of dragging the whole thing along, you see. And we bowled along. I mean, me in that ridiculous, huge dress with a jam pot on my head, you know. I mean, what bad proportion, that to the huge dress, you know. Crazy, but dear old Hein Heckroth didn't think of things like that. We literally went all along the Corniche, you see, in this fashion, with me with my poor little legs going like this and sort of trying not to do the Queen Mother, you know, and Chris Challis and all of them on the other side, and all the good sort of Monegasques and people thinking, my God, the mad English, you know, what are they going to do next? It was very funny. It was great, great fun. That shot of the lovely staircase, I had a feeling that it just, well, it was Cocteauesque. You know, it had that lovely sort of fantastic quality to it. It should have had that. It should have had that slightly dreamlike, fantastic quality more throughout it, I think. And I have to tell you, there was the most beautiful young French stagehand, that's all I can call him, at the side there, looking like Mel Gibson before Mel Gibson was born, probably, you know, but he had that sort of face. He was there the whole time, and I was very aware of him, I may say, as I was going up, you see, with all this beautiful young boy was there, and he picked some things in between takes and all the rest of it, and he brought them to me and said, "Pour votre linge, mademoiselle," from my bottom drawer, you see, to put in and all the rest of it. And my eyes went like this, and his were like this, you see, and I took these, I kept them in my suitcase all the time, and then I brought them back and I put them in the drawer. I had them for years.
Powell remembered the huge overgrown staircase he'd first discovered as a schoolboy, and he asked the Paris couturier, Jacques Fat, to design something very special for Vicky. The result made her look like a fairy tale princess entering the realm of enchantment. It had indeed something of the poetry of Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast, made 2 years earlier, and it looked forward to his modern myth of the poet, Orphée. This is Vicky's moment of initiation into the inner circle, and it bore a striking parallel to the planning meetings for the film that Jack Cardiff remembered.
I was lucky enough to be right in the beginning of all the discussions, mostly in Mickey's house, you know, with Emmerich there. And I met Maurice Scheer for the first time, who was delightful. On these early production meetings, I was surrounded by talent. Hein Heckroth, the production designer, and Brian Easdale doing the music, who had done Black Narcissus, Robert Helpman, and Massine.
Vicky had thought she was going to a special assignation with Lermontov. Who knows what she expected to happen between them? But now her embarrassment about being overdressed dissolves into the same ecstasy that we've already seen on Julian's face. She, too, can already imagine the red shoes. The two scenes that take place at this mountaintop villa recall Powell's explanation of another scene, which he filmed but later cut. This showed the members of Lermontov's family planning the red shoes around a cafe table. It was that ideal of a group of talented artists collaborating together that he felt so drawn to, but realized that scenes like these had already conveyed its appeal. Powell and Pressburger had assumed that they would use Alan Gray as composer for the film. Gray was the Polish-born Joseph Zmigrod, who had studied with Schoenberg and written theatre music in Berlin, before the Nazis forced him to leave Germany in 1933. In Britain, he started to write film music and eventually joined the Archers in 1943 for Blimp. Since then, he'd written the music for all their films, until, when he hadn't been available for Black Narcissus, they had brought in Brian Easdale, and the result had been a triumph. Jack Cardiff.
I was present at an very early meeting with Mickey and Emmerich, and we were round at Mickey's house, and Alan played his idea of the ballet for Red Shoes. Mickey and Emmerich didn't like it. That was that, and from then on, Brian Easdale came into the picture. I do remember that Alan sat down to play on the piano, and it was an upright piano, played it. They were looking at each other, and you could see they didn't like it. And I thought it was a tiny piece of film history, because what might have been, if it had been that music, might have changed in a completely different way. But that was quite dramatic. That was quite a turning point.
Brian Easdale.
The first thing was the ballet. As I remember it, they were to shoot the ballet, and I was to make a piano soundtrack. And Hein was to do a series of sketches of color, oil, I think, on card, of the important scenes of the ballet. And I worked with these colors in mind, had them at the side of my desk and piano. At that time, I think it had to be 15 minutes. So I composed far too much music to start with, the piano score, which I had to cut quite a lot. And eventually it came down to, I think, 9.5 to 10 minutes. And having composed the piano score and played it to Hein's sketches, I then orchestrated.
Another casting problem was the fictional composer Julian Craster. Once this character had lost its original angry young man identity, it became rather ill-defined, a counterpart to Vicky and later to Lermontov, but one excluded from the magical arena of the stage, although, interestingly, at the climax of the ballet, Julian does get to cross the footlights, at least in fantasy. The actor finally cast was Marius Goring, an old friend of the Archers who had appeared in their first film, The Spy in Black, playing a German U-boat officer. He then played the French Aristo who tries to tempt the hero of A Matter of Life and Death back to heaven. But could he play an English romantic lead? If a more conventional leading man had played Julian, the love affair would have been more conventionally passionate. But in fact, its rather companionable style seems to work well. But first, there was the slight visual problem that Marius Goring's natural hair colour was red.
I was doing a film in Germany, and then I suddenly received a telegram from Jack, who I hadn't met, just saying, "Must tell me immediately the colour of your hair." So I said, "I knew the thunder you wanted it for, but it's red." And then another one came along and said, "We need another colour." He said, "Because we cannot have your hair clashing with hers. A plane will be coming for you, pick you up, and take you down to where we're working." So it was the most wonderful thing to be doing.
That newspaper blowing along the promenade will find its way into the ballet that Julian's writing. It's a token of the love that will grow as they work together. But now there are practicalities to be arranged. The row of red shoes that Lermontov and Lubov are inspecting again recalls the planning that went into the film. Powell described how the designer, Hein Heckroth, had dyed no less than 17 pairs of dancing shoes in different shades of red just to find the right shade. The only time we see the stage from a conventional audience point of view in Red Shoes is when there's no audience and rehearsal is underway. It's a viewpoint that would be developed 30 years later as the basis of a whole show, a chorus line, in which one of the characters duly pays tribute to the Red Shoes. But when the film is criticised for giving an over-glamorous view of the ballet profession, this is surely a reaction against the sheer impact of its later sequences. For elsewhere, Powell and Pressburger are scrupulous in showing the relentless routine of practice and rehearsal. The film, after all, is about that mysterious process by which human sweat and planning create something unpredictable which can stir the emotions and inspire the mind. It's also, as we noted earlier, about the struggle between music and movement, which gives ballet theatre much of its tension and its form. Moira Shearer remembers how alien the process seemed to those who had worked only in the theatre.
Beecham did all the recordings beforehand. He loathed singers greatly. He loathed dancers even more. He wasn't going to have any truck with any of us. And so the score was written by Brian Easdale. It was finally decided and so on, and that it would be exact as he'd written it. Beecham got into the recording studio, did the whole thing, and that was that. And we just jolly well had to fit ourselves to his tempos. You see, there's no question about him sort of bothering about us at all. Well, in a way, quite right, because for a film, anyway, it's going to be so sort of messed about. And Bobby Helpman, arranged all his choreography to the playback. You see, there was nothing live at all about that. So it was made it quite easy. He could then put in the number of steps or whatever that were required for the tempos that Beecham had given.
Likely to succeed. Well, it's a bet.
Powell and Pressburger hadn't fully foreseen the consequences of deciding to make a real ballet when they took their original decision. Instead of only hiring performers for when they were needed, they soon found that the unit had become 120 strong, and this included what was virtually a complete ballet company, with all the backup this needed. However, the value of their investment is clear enough on the screen. Although we're rarely shown the full scale of the company, its presence can be felt everywhere. Indeed, linking scenes like this are almost more important than the fragments of rehearsal and full-dress performance, which are common to many backstage films. With the Red Shoes taking shape under his direction, Lermontov's relationship towards Vicky becomes protective and nurturing. She is, in a way, carrying his child, so he takes control of every detail of her life. We already know he has a horror of real sexual relations, which can tempt members of his family away. But here his creative relationship with Vicky makes him tender and even flirtatious. We could almost imagine he's in love with her, if we didn't know it's only with her body as a dancer.
You don't want to ruin your breathing, do you? And from today I've arranged that you shall have your lunch in my office. Craster?
Moira Shearer's Sadler's Wells commitments meant that she didn't join the Red Shoes until the unit had settled in at Monte Carlo. She ended up flying with Massine, which revealed another side of the great man.
I do not. But I'm afraid this is going to be your fate for the next 2 weeks.
We went from Northolt, the old RAF station, and I'd never sort of travelled anywhere with Massey before. I'd only just worked with him in the theatre, and that was that. And we met at an ungodly hour in the morning. And, of course, the plane didn't take off when it should. A little propeller job, tiny. So he said, darling, have breakfast. Well, I watched him have 3-course breakfast, you see. And actually, I was extremely hungry, too. I had a 3-course breakfast, and then there was a bit more time, and we got onto the plane. We were given an enormous breakfast. Yassine had another enormous breakfast. This is wonderful. We had to come down at Le Bourget in Paris. No de Gaulle, no anything like that. There was a long hold-up before the connection to Nice. Darling, I'm going to have another breakfast. Will you join me? You see, he said. And by that time, I really had to, but I picked a bit at the very, very last one. I watched him have these 3 enormous, this little tiny, slim, paired man, beautiful, beautiful face, and he knocked back all this stuff, and we then arrived at Nice. It didn't take all that long, 2.5 hours or something, 3 hours maybe. And there was the whole unit to meet us. And I hadn't met anybody at this point at all, except Powell. And an immense lunch had been laid on, and it was blazing heat, end of July. And I watched Yassine go through, 10 courses at least. He didn't move at all. There was no stomach. There was no anything, no bowels. He didn't undo the top of the trouser, anything. And I just thought, this is a great man.
While Vicky eats and Julian plays, the dialogue between them touches on one of the most controversial issues in Red Shoes, how it translates dance into visual imagery in the ballet. Julian claims his music will suggest the images that Vicky and the dancers will then copy. Vicky's contemptuous, clouds and birds. Doesn't he know how hard it is to get up in the air without worrying about stuff like that? That's as far as they go, but it's enough to prepare the audience for what they'll soon be seeing in the ballet. Perhaps there's a parallel here with Richard Strauss's last opera, Capriccio, in which the poet and a composer bicker over which is more important, words or music. And of course they do this while singing the opera. It's the same kind of romantic modernism as the Red Shoes, making the medium of opera or ballet as much the message as the apparent subject of the piece. We've already heard how Lermontov sees the Red Shoes as about the dance instinct itself. Now we're getting into the issue of whether music and movement together can create a special kind of imagery. These are pretty abstract issues, but what makes the Red Shoes great, as well as enjoyable, is the way it explores so many different ideas. But now, as we move into the hectic final rehearsal, it's time to hear something from Jack Cardiff about how he started with Technicolor in 1936.
I was an operator at the time, an assistant cameraman, and I just got home from the studios at Isleworth, and I had to go all the way to Bournemouth, which was a long journey. And my mother told me that the studios wanted me to go straight back, and I wasn't very happy about that. Why? Oh, well, there's a new thing called Technicolor, and the Technicolor people had come over from Hollywood to choose an operator, a young operator, who would be taken to America from England to study Technicolor because they were going to introduce it in England. When I went in to be questioned, having given the initial thing, which school did you go to, which school of photography was this, what is this equation with light and so on, I said, I'm sorry, but I think I'm wasting your time because I'm very bad at this sort of thing. And there was a shocked silence, and they said, well, what sort of thing do you attribute to becoming a cameraman? And I said, well, I study paintings. I look at light wherever I am and see reflections off the wall, and I study it. But it's the paintings that's the great thing. And they looked at me, and one of them said, which side of the face does Rembrandt use on his paintings? So I took a guess. I wasn't sure. I said the right side, and it was the right side. And then they asked me about other painters. I got sort of warming up, talking about Peter de Hoogh and Vermeer and people like that I'd like so much. And they said, right, okay. And I left thinking that was it, and that I'd sort of made myself into an idiot by saying that I knew nothing about the technical side. But ironically, I was chosen. But then plans were changed. Instead of me going to Hollywood, they brought the Technicolor plant, and they built a plant in England, and I was automatically put onto that. That's how I started, working in the laboratory. I used to do a few commercials. That was before commercials were commercials. They were just one every year or something. But on those things, I was very lucky because I used to use all the ideas I was developing. I could make all kinds of mistakes, and it didn't matter because it wasn't like on an ordinary picture. You could do things over and over. So that was good training. And automatically, I was on the first Technicolor film that was made in Europe, Wings of the Morning. I worked on travelogues at first at Technicolor, and I went all over the world with this precious camera. And the camera technician, the assistant who had to be with it, his job, he had to sleep with the camera. He never let it out of his sight for a moment.
Cardiff's apprenticeship was to stand him in good stead after he joined the Archers, for each film would throw up new challenges, and as Powell said, there has never been another colour cameraman like Jack Cardiff for his invention, imagination and sheer audacity. Filming The Red Shoes needed all of these. The main idea agreed beforehand was to go beyond the auditorium and the backstage viewpoint. Putting a camera in either of these traditional positions creates a barrier between the film viewer and the performers. But what if the dance were to be staged solely for the film viewer's benefit, if the camera became a part of the performance? This may sound simple enough, but in 1947 the idea would have terrified most directors, not to mention their editors and cameramen. If you abandon the basic shape of the auditorium and stage, how will the audience know where it is from shot to shot? The result could easily be a bewildering mess, or it could be a breakthrough into a new kind of spectacle. Ciné-ballet, some called it. As a matter of fact, the Archers weren't the only filmmakers thinking along these lines. Several years before The Red Shoes, an American independent, Maya Deren, made a short film called A Study of Choreography for the Camera. Deren's title is almost longer than her film, which lasts only a few minutes, but its main idea is directly in line with that of The Red Shoes. And interestingly, Deren had been a dancer before she turned to film. In A Study of Choreography, a dancer performs a series of classical dance movements, and there's a cut in the midst of each of these, so that they're completed in a different space from the one they started in. Through the film, we follow the dancer's movement and accept that it's creating an unreal space. which is what happens on a grand scale in the ballet of the Red Shoes. To achieve this new approach, Powell realized that he would have to find a new production designer. Alfred Junger had been the mainstay of the Archers ever since they started. He had solid experience going all the way back to the Ufa studio, where they knew how to build things properly. But the Red Shoes didn't need building. It needed a more illusionist, insubstantial style of design. If the decor for the ballet was too solid, it would remain a theatre ballet, even while it was in a film studio. What Powell wanted was something that didn't yet exist, film ballet, and for this he needed a painter rather than an architect. The ideal person, he was embarrassed to discover, already worked for him. Hein Heckroth was a German, like Junger, but he was a painter who had trained at one of the great avant-garde schools, the Bauhaus, and worked in ballet before coming to England with his Jewish wife to escape Hitler. Heckroth had designed the costumes for both A Matter of Life and Death and Black Narcissus, and he was already doing the same job on Red Shoes. Powell approached him, and there was a nasty clash over who was doing what, which led to Junger leaving and Heckroth becoming the film's production designer. Again, you can see how much the film itself echoes what had gone into it, taking a chance with new talent. Heckroth set to work to visualize the ballet as a series of 200 oil sketches, which Jack Cardiff had to realize on film, and you can see the film they made of these sketches elsewhere in the set.
Hein was given the job of being the art director. He actually was obviously much more attuned to ballet than Junger, because he had worked in ballet for years in Germany, and he had designed a thing called the Green Table, and it was a political thing with all these politicians, which was very amusing. But he was a very clever man, and he was a good painter, and we were firm friends. I mean, when the film was being prepared, as I say, I worked very hard with him. We worked hard together, analyzing what we had, what the problems were, and he'd make us sketches in color. I would do my best to copy exactly the mood of the paintings. Most art directors have got a certain style, or they want it done this way, you know, but with Hein, he was quite happy if I suggested something. He'd say, yes, well, okay, we'll do this, and then we do that. We built together. And the thing was, once he had put down he used to paint oil on paper usually, and got the color right. And we used to say, well, how about if the sky was really intensely blue here, and these black shadows? We said, yes, yes. We were working together on it, and I would religiously work from that sketch to make the actual scene. And it wasn't always easy when you had actors in it. I mean, when you got actors moving about, you've got to move the lights sometimes, but it worked very well.
The Red Shoes approach doesn't only apply to ballet. It's about creating any subjective world that the viewer can enter. And Martin Scorsese found this was the only way he could get inside the ring for Raging Bull.
It's the idea of the dance. It's what the dancer feels in their body as they're dancing, not even what their impressions are in their mind. When I got to do Raging Bull, I had a real problem with the fight scenes. I realized that I didn't know anything about boxing. Boxing to me was very boring. In the early 50s, they would show a championship fight in the movie theater on a Saturday, and people would go see it. But of course, it was all 15 rounds. It was all shot from one angle, and you already knew who the winner was. So for me, I never understood boxing. I was never interested in sports. First of all, it didn't seem to be a sport to me, two people beating each other up in a ring. After seeing the choreography that Jake LaMotta gave De Niro, I began to realize that this is not only bigger than I had thought, meaning that it was much more involved in what I had to do to get across what I wanted to get across in these fight scenes within this little square ring. And I realized it was dance, although I didn't verbalize it, but I remembered the impression of the Red Shoes Ballet. And I realized that in the ring, in Raging Bull, we should never go out of the ring as much as possible. There's only a couple of times we do. Always stay inside the ring and stay inside the fighter's head. See it from his point of view and hear it from his point of view. You get the impression of the fight, the impression of the battle, of the struggle, of the suffering. You therefore are totally free to do anything you want visually. I realized that it should be the impression. It should be what Jake felt, how he perceived things in the ring. And therefore, it also made it very personal. Kind of hinted at the same thing in The Last Waltz, where I decided never to show the audience. Always stay on the stage, each song, especially the numbers played by the band itself on the stage, because then you begin to see the interrelation of the group, interrelationship. between the performers on the stage. There's no doubt that this comes directly from this ballet sequence.
But however exciting this new kind of film ballet is for the viewer, it posed a lot of new problems for the filmmakers, not least how to link up all the tiny fragments of dance and music which they were shooting in so many different setups. Moira Shearer remembers the problem vividly.
When we had shot a minute and a half, which is, X number of bars of music, there was the film lying on the floor in one direction, the cutting room, and they had the music on tape at the other side. And of course, nobody knew what fitted with what, and they hadn't realized this, I think, that they would have these two things, but there would be no way of dovetailing them exactly so that you got the correct thing on the screen for the exact number of crotchets, quavers, and whatnots.
Moira Shearer explained that it was an experienced dancer, Alan Carter, with whom she had worked in the Sadler's Wells Company, who advised on much of the final synchronization of music and picture. He also helped by filling in the background choreography for the crowd scenes. Meanwhile, there were also new lighting problems. Technicolor film needed a high ambient light level, which would have cancelled out any normal spotlight. So, Jack Cardiff had to think bigger.
That spotlight was terrific. It was made specially for the film, and it was over 300 amps. It was water-cooled. Although at one period in the ballet, we took it out because it destroyed the image, the isolation, when we had stark pictures and the creeping hands and things. We just took it away. And that, of course, was part of the whole scene, that we could do literally what we wanted to do. That we didn't have to conform to continuity. It became like an abstract piece of surrealism, obviously. See, there's no spotlight on that one, because it would have destroyed the mood of the whole thing. And this scene in particular, a spotlight would have ruined that. I had these hard shadows and this very deep blue sky.
As the ballet's starting point fades from memory, so the conventions of the stage, spotlight, scenery, corps de ballet, all disappear. And something new happens. The Red Shoes story becomes, quite specifically, Vicky's dream or nightmare. Images of the men in her life start to appear as fantasy figures, revealing the significance they have for her. Lyubov is her demanding ballet master, as well as the shoemaker who has condemned her to dance to her death. Lermontov and Julian appear first as threatening figures, then they collapse, as Vicky seems to move into a new space. She leaves the town behind and floats through the clouds. We'll come back later to the relationship between this and Anderson's story, but here we're moving through a kind of painterly sequence which borrows freely from many artists' styles to create a kind of dreamscape for Vicky. It's a state of mind turned into an imaginary landscape, and Heckroth and Powell use movement and metaphor rather than narrative to carry us from image to image.
Now we're entering into from De Chirico to Dali, I suppose. But this is a very abstract sequence. If we'd used a spotlight here, it would have ruined it. Very convenient to forget the spot. It becomes stage and then it becomes surrealistic and abstract. That's another optical shot, obviously. And this is the paper dance.
We've seen the scrap of paper on the terrace. That's like a pre-echo of this sequence. And of course, the idea of a discarded newspaper had been around in 20th century art since the Cubists had first pasted newsprint onto their paintings. It was already a familiar symbol of transience and chance. But I wonder if we can also find in this Paperman dance a nod in the direction of the Wizard of Oz, where the Scarecrow and the Tin Man become human in Dorothy's dream. Diaghilev had brought popular art into the ballet. So why shouldn't the Archers do the same for popular cinema?
And the idea I had of Massine making an entrance, we'll see it in a moment, where he leaps into frame, and I altered the speed of the camera so that he would appear to hover for a fraction of a second. Cheating like mad, of course, but I think it paid off. There's the leap. It was on a par, I suppose, with Nijinsky's leap from Spectre to La Rose, and it worked very well. We speeded up the camera from about 24 frames a second, which is normal, to about double, 48 pictures, just for a fraction of a second. Seeing it again now, 50 years after it was made, it's difficult to realize that at that time when the film came out, this sort of thing was very different from the usual stuff that was seen.
The Red Shoes ballet sequence itself was the first time that a whole movie was stopped and an entire sequence was shown, which had to do emotionally with the theme of the film and the relationships of the characters and things like that. But it was basically stopping the movie for a ballet sequence, which was later then capitalized by Gene Kelly and Minnelli and MGM in An American in Paris about a year or two later. The thing about it is that everything that I think you could want to know or learn about Powell Pressburger, you could probably, if you study shot by shot the ballet of the Red Shoes, you'd begin to understand. Silent film was a language that was totally based on visual images, and you had to communicate totally visually. You couldn't do it verbally. So that when you look at the Red Shoes sequence, you begin to see all different techniques, very, very many different techniques, very much silent film techniques that were employed in silent films. Quick cutting, that you can see certain kinds of jump cuts, almost, that became very fashionable in the new wave films later in the 50s, late 50s, early 60s. At the same time, they were being explored by Russian filmmakers in the 1920s. Also, different techniques, camera movement, swish pans, superimpositions, and especially very, very normal, common silent film technique, changing the speed of the camera. And I was fascinated by the ballet sequence because I tried to figure out which shot was high speed, which one was reduced speed so that the characters move faster. And then ultimately, all these images together, plus the content of the image itself, the use of color, the use of lighting, the composition, the angle of the camera, which is incorporated, I guess, in the composition, all of this, along with the music, you get into the area of what Powell Pressburger were trying to do with the composed film. I begin to realize that maybe ballet dancers may not like that, because you don't really see, not full attention is given constantly to the full figure of the dancer. Instead, I think what you get, and here's where the drama comes in, I think what you get is the idea of the dance, the spirit of the dance. I think you get what goes on in the mind of the dancer. I think you see it from their point of view. And it's perfect for that movie because all this is going on in her mind. They do take risks. For example, when the conductor comes up from out of the pit and walks onto the stage with her, first it's Sarius Goring, and then it cuts and it almost pushes the edge. It almost pushes you off the edge there a little bit. It's a little overdone.
When Julian rises from the pit and crosses the stage, only to become Ivan, it's as if Powell and Pressburger are reaching out towards the kind of psychodrama that we find in film noir around this time. Think of Wells's Lady from Shanghai, or Hitchcock's Spellbound, or Lang's Secret Beyond the Door. All of them Freudian cliffhangers, where delusion becomes illusion, usually in a torrent of overwrought images. Maybe Scorsese's right, and Powell went too far here, but surely this is the actual climax of the love story, where Julian joins Vicky in the fantasy they've created together.
When she's lifted in the air, and they said you'll be like a cloud, and they dissolve to a cloud. It almost gets a little too literal, but they take those risks. They take them. I don't necessarily think those two things work very well, but they seem to be like a gambler on a roll. You know, they didn't want anybody to stop them or tell them where to go and not, give them limitations. These guys seem to be flying along. And so they hit a few bumps here and there. But this is such a remarkable piece, especially the way it begins and ends, I think, with the proscenium.
It wasn't a ballet, you see, that could ever have been done straight into the theatre. And there were so many tricks, too, you see. I mean, all the, the newspaper into the man, back into the newspaper again. And, didn't we turn into flowers and clouds and nonsense up in the air and then back to ourselves and we were lifted down again and so on. All that, you see, you couldn't do in the theatre. It would be impossible. Our great difficulty, from the dancing point of view, was, first of all, we danced on concrete. And that was not happy at all. Terribly bad. Our ankles swelled up like that, and calf muscles went into the most awful sort of knots after a number of hours. They had floor cloths down and so on, but you still were jumping and so on concrete. But quite apart from that, we never got more than X number of seconds at a time. Or perhaps, with the greatest luck, half a minute. And of course, none of us could really get going. None of us could really dance because you were stopped all the time, so that it was stiff, it was rigid. I minded that desperately because it was not the way one danced.
When she puts the red shoes on, they become demonic. It's scary, a scary ballet. It's a film within a film, She tries to take a knife and cut the straps of the red shoes, and it turns into a twig. And then she throws, and then it somehow winds up back into a knife, and the knife gets stuck in the floor. Look at the cutting there, and look at the speed of the camera in each one of those shots. It's very interesting. Later on, as I say, French New Wave and Italian New Wave films played with these things when they were breaking up a form of cinema, trying to reinvent cinema. These guys were doing it already.
The Red Shoes fable and Vicky's dream have run their course. We're back on the stage, back to a conventional tragic ending.
Massine is over the top sometimes, most of the time, but somehow he has the right mood that he somehow makes it all worthwhile. It's certainly, call it professional ballet over the top.
Despite any shortcomings due to his age, Massine was the film's true link with the Russian ballet tradition that it celebrated.
To be perfectly honest, he was, by the time 47 came, as a dancer, he was way over the hill, well up in his 50s. And he'd never been a classic dancer anyway. He'd very bad legs. Diaghilev was very conscious of his bad legs. So was Massine himself. But he was a marvellous character dancer. And if you watch him as the shoemaker in the Red Shoes ballet, he just does a little bit too much all the time, when he was wonderful, when he didn't. In his earlier days, he was a minimalist, really.
Minimalism wasn't what Powell and Pressburger were aiming at in the Red Shoes, and one can understand only too well how difficult it must have been for Moira Shearer and the other dancers to understand that they were only one ingredient in a grand design. The dance, like the music performance, had to look convincing, but it didn't have to be great, sustained dancing, because it's really the film that's dancing, in a daring new way. And when Red Shoes was seen in Hollywood, where it was eagerly analysed, the result was a burst of, inspiration. An American in Paris is the example usually given. But most would agree that this is by no means Gene Kelly's best dance film. In fact, any direct influence the Red Shoes had was probably unfortunate, because its discoveries, like those of Raging Bull, aren't ones that others can easily use.
Monte Carlo at that time should have been absolutely wonderful for us. And maybe for one or two of the actors and the crew, who had quite a lot of spare time. Perhaps it was. But I literally was hauled out of bed by a darling makeup man called Ernie Gasser. Oh, wonderful creature. He would come into the hotel bedroom and haul me out 4:30 every morning, and then down to this awful little trailer caravan thing to have all this stuff slapped on my face. And it was so hot that it would run off, like sort of rice pudding, and used to hold up powder puffs and say, wonderful Cockney, oh, bash your face against that. It was so sweet. But it helped, because one was really exhausted by it all.
Jack Cardiff also remembers how dedicated Massine was during the shooting.
Massine was an extraordinary man. He was very serious and quiet, and dedicated, of course, to the ballet. And he was always the first one at the bar. We had a barmaid in the studios where they all used to practice first thing in the morning. Massine was always there first thing. Robert Helpman used to make snide remarks, saying, poor old thing, he's feeling his age. But, I think Massine was the most fit man on the set, in spite of his age. He was over 50 then, I think.
Massine recalls Pavlova as he pays a compliment to Vicky, and Robert Helpman had actually danced in Pavlova's company. There's a network of associations and references in the film that give it a very special feeling of authenticity. It's a bit like Godard's use of Fritz Lang as himself and Jack Palance as the archetypal American in his film about movie making, Le Mépris. We're expected, in both these cases, to know what the figures stand for.
All these ballet people, they work so very hard. I think the corps de ballet, they're rather almost like a religion. They're like nuns to me, because they earn so little money and they work so hard, and they have to repair their shoes at their expense, and they are dedicated, completely dedicated. Another thing was that the film Corps de Ballet had considerable difficulty with the wood floors that we had in the studio. They were tougher than the theatrical ballet, which is interesting. But they suffered a lot with their costumes having to be fitted exactly right, and they pulled tightly, which is unusual in a way. Their shoes were too tight and they had blisters. They really went through hell, I think, but they were wonderful.
The Red Shoes is, of course, a great success, and as the telephone congratulations and inquiries pour in, Lermontov is in his element. He bends his end of one conversation to throw Julian a compliment on his music, and to announce what Julian will be writing next, which comes as news to Julian. This Lermontov has nothing to do with Diaghilev. He's entirely a 1940s film producer, trying to make the most of his assets. And indeed Korda, who was always short of money, had made a modest profit on selling the Red Shoes script back to Pressburger, although he'd probably have held out for more if he hadn't needed the money so urgently. 2 years later, when the Archers had left rank to return temporarily to Korda's fold, they found that they too had become pawns in his frantic effort to stay afloat. He arranged co-production deals for both Gone to Earth and The Elusive Pimpernel, which deprived the filmmakers of final approval, and he even managed to collect a remake fee from the latter film's budget because he'd made the original Scarlet Pimpernel. Yet despite all the double crosses, they loved him, and they felt that as a producer, his heart was in the right place. Julian seems to leave this meeting with similar feelings of gratitude, despite Lermontov's haste. For next, Lermontov has an important meeting with the true object, or vehicle, of his desires.
There was very little plot. It's really the characters and the relationship of the three characters. And for me, the relationship between Anton Walbrook and Moira Shearer. Also, the side relationships between Leni Massine, Robert Helpman, Shearer, and Walbrook. And of course, Marius Goring. In a funny way, the love story for me is almost just a device, really just a device to hinge all this recreation of a world where, as Michael put it, art is worth dying for. I don't know if I'd agree with him, but that's what the film's about, apparently. I didn't know that. He told me that it was. But it's great to have that kind of passion. I think it's great to have that kind of passion, if you agree with it or not, that art is worth dying for filmmakers to get together and concoct this and perpetrate it onto the world at that time. It was fascinating, the guts and the risks that they took, especially after World War II. What I like about it sometimes, it seems out of control. Their emotions are out of control. Not the characters, but the people who made the film. The passion is out of control. And I think that's something that's very rare. Something very rare is created when that occurs.
A passion for ballet had gripped Jack Cardiff during the making of The Red Shoes, and he wanted to shoot at least a record of Massine and Moira Shearer dancing one of the classical pieces they'd done together, La Boutique Fantasque. When a 2-week holiday was announced during the production of the film, he decided to try his luck.
I had this idea of doing a ballet of La Boutique Fantasque. And Massine was agreeable, and I got the rights, the musical rights, and Moira was agreeable. I was so delighted because I worked with Massine preparing this thing in 2 weeks, and we were going to just record the entire play in a theatre, the ballet, with 3 cameras. It was really not like a creative movie. It was just a straight recording of a wonderful ballet with Massine, never could be done again. We needed a corps de ballet. And when I asked Ninette de Valois if we could use her corps de ballet, there was a flat refusal. She hated films and didn't want anything to do with it. It was a missed opportunity if ever there was one.
Vicky has accepted Lermontov's plans for her career. She has become the willing vehicle of his ambition and desire to dominate the world of ballet. The sequence that shows this, opening out like a concertina fold, is another case of what the Cuban critic Cabrera Infante described as relative time, and we'll hear more about that a little later. In a flash, as it were, she spans the whole repertoire: Coppelia, Carnival, Les Sylphides. Such montage sequences were already something of a cliché by the time of The Red Shoes. They were an essential ingredient of Warner biopics in the 30s and of showbiz biographies. But they could also be used meaningfully and even creatively, as Orson Welles had shown with his ironic montage sequences in Citizen Kane. Here, the effect is to make Vicky's success something more conventional and routine. Our identification with her identification with the ballet of The Red Shoes is weakened as we see her become, well, just another prima ballerina. We're also struck by how stagey these fragments from the great ballets look, since they're shown in theatrical form rather than in the subjective style of the Red Shoes. It's as if our image of Vicky is being replaced by Lermontov's, presumably, since he is now masterminding her career. From Powell and Pressburger's Red Shoes novel, we gather that what's happening off-screen at this time is a standoff between Vicky and Julian. She's completely wrapped up in developing her repertoire and refuses all his invitations until, and we don't see this in the film, she suddenly invites him to go with her to Antibes, where a tactful fade-out leaves them alone together on her aunt's yacht. A novel, of course, works very differently from a film, and this novel has the peculiarity of being written 30 years after its authors made the film. But a comparison of what the movie and the book choose to tell and not tell is highly instructive. Mostly it serves to remind us how much the movie doesn't show. The fact that we don't see any contact between Vicky and Julian preserves the mystery or purity of their relationship and makes it all the more surprising when we do eventually discover how far they've got. Within the Archers partnership, it seems to have been Powell who took the lead in ruthlessly cutting scenes which had become redundant. When we look back through their scripts, it's clear how he and Pressburger would lay out the whole structure and then look for ways of making it cinematic by taking out links and allowing the audience to fill these in with their imagination. And out of these subtractions came some of the most memorable sequences, like the stuffed animal heads in the photo album, which cover the passing of years in Blimp. Here, the repetition of the late-night office ritual has lulled us into a sense of routine. So when Lermontov breaks the routine and asks Dmitri to book a table for two, the effect is seismic. Jack Cardiff came to know Powell and Pressburger well, and he valued their different contributions to the craft of filmmaking.
Michael was the crazy one, the spontaneous one. Let's do this, let's do that. And Emmerich was the deep thinker, and he said, well, Mickey, I think it's better you don't do too much because of this, and he would supply, and Mickey, yes, I suppose you're right, But it didn't nullify Michael's actions, but it kept a good balance. I said to Michael the first time we got together, when I was first engaged to work with him, I said, what are you making films for, Michael? I mean, are you trying to put points over so the audience understand exactly what you're doing? Like, for instance, Hitchcock will be absolutely sure not to have any similarity between the casts, so that if so-and-so looks like so-and-so, you get confused. They've got to look completely different. He's always thinking the audience won't like this, they won't understand this, so he's got to make it absolutely sure. A big close-up to emphasize this, but Mick is the opposite. He said, I make films for myself. He said, I hope the audience understand them, but he said, I'm not going to go down to any level. That was his way of doing it. But Emmerich was a tremendous influence because he had that bit of sanity, that came in, which helped.
Ever since Powell had taken his life and career in his hands to make The Edge of the World on a remote Scottish island in 1936, he'd been ready to take chances. Whether this adventurous spirit would have produced any masterpieces without the deep sense of structure and the wry humour that Pressburger contributed is debatable. But by the end of the war, the Archers sensed that they needed to find a new direction if they were to stay ahead of the game. Pressburger spoke of setting traps to capture magic when he tried to explain the mystical quality of films like A Canterbury Tale and I Know Where I'm Going. Powell explained it in terms of going beyond naturalism, or trying to create what he called a composed film. This meant trying to bring together every aspect of the film, including aspects of the image and sound, which are normally quite automatic, bring them under an artistic control, just as an animator like Walt Disney, whom Powell knew and admired, would do. In this scheme of things, the dramatic aspect of the film would have to change as well. And, as Martin Scorsese notes, The Red Shoes already takes considerable risks in this direction.
The story is very risky because it could be, you could look at it in one way. One person will look at it and say it's just pure melodrama. Another person would say, well, it's trashy. It's just kind of pulp material in a way. And on the other hand, it's heightened a sense of reality that I liked about it. And he seemed to get away with it. They seemed to get away with it by use of color, composition in the frame, and also the performances, naturally the writing. And the performances seemed to be right verging on the edge of hysteria. Very, very different from the type of film that I had seen up to that point. Maybe Duel in the Sun has some of that. It was one of the first films I can remember seeing. But especially for British films, I found it to be a strange picture that was not the normal picture from England, I shouldn't say normal, but not the average film that came from England. This is something very special. The characters seem to be fighting the frame almost with their emotions. They seem to be bursting out of the frame in a way. And anything could happen any given moment, visually.
It was in I Know Where I'm Going that Powell had started to pack his frames with tension, and by the time of Black Narcissus, the emotion was something you could almost feel radiating from the screen. Here he's in holiday mood. This is like a film crew party. But although the Archers tried to keep a family feeling among their associates, there's no doubt that Powell could be a difficult director for actors, mainly because he relied heavily on casting decisions and on the actor's intuition. Marius Goring remembers trying to develop his character.
I tried to make it as far as possible myself. If I was in that situation, what would I do? How would I say it? Which I think pretty well went off. His way of working was, there was saying that you ought to know what it is you're going to play, and not me tell you what you want to play. And I had a wonderful time with that. Michael would say, "No, that's not quite right, is it?" I'd say, "No, it wasn't. No. Yeah, well, hurry up and do it." I'd go off, and in a quarter of an hour, we'd have the whole thing going. To work with somebody like that was marvellous, and I've never got over it. I mean, I've never been with a director who's as wonderful as that.
Moira Shearer had never acted before, and she asked Marius Goring for advice on how to handle her dialogue scenes.
We talked quite a lot together. She came to me and said, "When I'm not dancing, show me what I ought to be doing." I did one or two things, and then when we started just to rehearse, Mickey came and said, "Oh, don't think much of that. It's your doing." And I said, "Well, she's never acted." And so, "Well, she ought to know." She went into tears. It's one of those things that really Michael wasn't very nice about. It was the only sort of sad thing, I think, about her.
The tension between Powell and Shearer soon became obvious to everyone, and it has remained a sore point. It flared up again when the first volume of Powell's memoirs appeared in 1986, when Moira Shearer challenged his account of her motives and behaviour. The issue, in a way, is very much what The Red Shoes itself is about: life and art. These two determined artists, the dancer and the director, both recognised a strength in the other, which enabled them to do some of their best work together. But they seem to have remained on different wavelengths, with Powell unable to understand why Shearer should despise cinema, and Shearer continuing to believe that his films betrayed her skills as a dancer. Brian Easdale has a clear view of the Archers' relative strengths.
I always felt that Emmerich was the storyteller and writer primarily, and always his points were to do with story and continuity, whereas Michael's was visual and dramatic. They'd had contranto, is that the word, at times, but they usually came to an agreement.
Did you see that? She smiled at Cropster.
I don't think so.
I suppose you'll be sending me to an oculist next.
Lermontov has described his attitude to ballet as religious, so the best way to register his disgust at Vicky and Julian's love affair is to show it as an intimate exchange taking place during a performance. Lermontov's response makes this seem like an act of blasphemy, an erotic encounter in a church. Once again, we see it through his eyes, and the outcome is inevitable as he moves to eliminate his rival for Vicky's attention and throw the company into disarray.
Good evening, Mr. Lermontov. I'm afraid the score's still a bit rough, but I see you've had time to look at it.
Yes, Mr. Cropster. I have looked at it. However, it is not about your music that I wish to talk at the moment.
We've not said anything yet about the problems that were looming around the Red Shoes production itself, although these were to have an important effect on its reception and subsequent career. When Powell and Pressburger had started working with Arthur Rank in 1942, it was wartime, and the relationship had been, perhaps surprisingly, quite informal. Arthur Rank had been a flour miller and was no movie tycoon, any more than the Archers were pushy independents. But under war conditions, a relationship had emerged which was mutually beneficial. A series of small producing units was established under the umbrella of a holding company called Independent Producers, and through these, the Archers and their fellow British independents enjoyed one of the happiest and most creative periods in the whole of British filmmaking. But like all good things, it couldn't last. The forces that changed the face of British cinema weren't only domestic. With the end of the war, a new relationship had to be negotiated with Hollywood, and this was dramatically changed when, in August 1947, the British Treasury slapped a massive 75% withholding tax on American film earnings in Britain in an effort to improve the balance of payments situation. The American film industry responded quickly with a blockade. No US films would be sent to Britain as long as the tax stayed in place. Negotiations took place and agreement was finally reached 6 months later, and Hollywood films once again appeared on British screens. But the long-term consequences of what became known as the Film War were serious. The main British producers, Rank and Korda, had sharply increased their levels of production while the film war raged, and when it was settled, they were seriously overcommitted, with a surplus of films and a backlog of American imports waiting in the wings. This was the immediate background to the Red Shoes production, and it helps to explain why the film going seriously over budget caused such concern among Rank executives. For Rank was no longer the intimate company it had been in the early 40s. And when the executives walked out of their first screening of the Red Shoes with stony faces, convinced they'd lost their shirts on an art movie that no one would want to see, the Archers knew it was time to pack up and move on.
Mr. Craster's leaving the company.
But at any rate, while the Red Shoes was in production, the idea of making a film that could equal anything coming from Hollywood would certainly have been in more than one mind on the set. Jack Cardiff recalls everyone on the film determined to do their best.
If the atmosphere on any film, I suppose, where it's not so much that the director, who usually has a say and says, I want this film to have this character all the way through it, but perhaps the director himself doesn't realize that the various departments are saying, my photography is going to be just as good as Hollywood photography, and the art director is saying, I want my sets to look as good as Hollywood, you know, and there's this subconscious thing that's going on which the director might not even be aware of. I mean, in most cases, the director would say, I want the sequence to be larger than life, it's got to be. But it has a Hollywood look, but it also has a theatrical look.
Craster's leaving the company.
The image of Massine dancing solo beneath a giant spotlight is so breathtakingly simple, so striking, that it immediately changes our relationship with the whole space we've come to know. Here, we've seen him isolated as an individual, instead of being surrounded by the company as usual. And when Lermontov, leaning nonchalantly against his cane, tells him that Julian's leaving and the new ballet is cancelled, he reacts like an individual. That means scrapping his work as well. This eerie setting, created entirely by lighting, puts the two men together in a new arena, where it's one will against the other.
Hello, you two. Isn't love wonderful?
Bonsoir, Jules. Hello.
When Ratov brings the news that Lermontov won't compromise and the full impact of his determination sinks in, shockwaves run through the company.
Of course, he doesn't really want you to go, Grisha. He's very sorry.
Well, in that case, I will think about it.
What about Julian?
I have never seen him quite as bad as this. He talked a great deal about ingratitude and disloyalty.
The Red Shoes novel spells out more fully Vicky's disappointment that the others are not prepared to make a bigger fuss. But in the film, we have no access to her inner thoughts. We can only follow her actions. And her response to the news that Lermontov is going to Paris next morning is to plan to confront him at the railway station.
Paris by the 8:15 train.
The sight of Anton Walbrook in the flesh, sophisticated as ever and wearing his usual off-screen dark glasses, must have been daunting enough for Moira Shearer.
He was a remote figure then. I mean, he was remote to everybody. He was very, very, very grand. He was the old school, you see, Austrian. He'd been in the German cinema, of course, and I saw, goodness, before I was 10, I remember being taken in Glasgow to see Masquerade with a wonderful Czech actress called Paula Vesely. Oh, goodness, she was a beautiful actress. And Anton, very young, having his first sort of moment as, a young sort of leading juvenile, really. But he was completely swamped by this wonderful, wonderful woman. But anyway, I remember seeing that. And then, of course, one saw the odd thing, Prince Albert here and there and everywhere. And few things that he did for Michael Powell. And then suddenly one was confronted with him in this. But he didn't mingle even with Marius, for goodness sakes, who was a very well-established, good actor. And he was always behind his dark glasses. And he was always and he sort of floated by, sort of Edward Gordon Craigish and so on, all that. And I was awfully amused by this. And we hadn't anyone like that in the ballet at all. We were all mad as hatters and just sort of thumped around. And I couldn't believe this.
Lermontov's image here underlines his Svengali role. His look is hypnotic enough normally, but when he wears dark glasses, it becomes positively menacing. It's a refusal to be seen, a denial of contact, which will allow him to withdraw back to his temple of dance.
But even if I do...
Lermontov is contemptuous of Vicky's declaration of independence. Where can she go? How can she ever work on the same level again if she leaves him? He has the power to make and to break her career if she refuses his terms. This relationship might be seen as a reflection of the hold that Diaghilev had over his leading dancer and greatest discovery, Nijinsky, and that relationship eventually destroyed Nijinsky. And it's an interesting footnote that Alexander Korda, the other model for Lermontov, apparently supported Nijinsky's widow after her husband's early tragic death. In a moment we'll see Julian waiting for Vicky's return, in an image that looks like one of Matisse's Riviera window paintings. His response to the news that she's leaving with him is to throw the ties he's packing out of the window in a joyful confetti. It's an image that looks forward to the moment in Powell's Peeping Tom, a decade later, when a visitor to the film set where Mark is working drops the pens from his pocket, and we see them falling towards us in slow motion. Here, however, it's an explosion of happiness.
I'm coming with you!
The image of Lermontov, alone and brooding, has become one of the most powerful in the film. It forces us to see the lives and careers of all the other characters as almost literally creatures of Lermontov's mind. It's a superb example of drawing the audience into a complicity with the film, and one that has long intrigued Martin Scorsese.
I remember being taken by the scene in which Lermontov is in his hotel room alone with this apparently a Russian Cossack shirt. I'm not quite sure. I don't know what but this incredible velvet shirt that he had on. When he looks in the mirror, the self-loathing and takes possession of him, and he smashes the mirror. And I remember being very struck by it. And I think why, besides the look on Wahlberg's face, besides the way Wahlberg played the part, besides the maroon or red velvet shirt he's wearing, besides the ornate, the Baroque room he's in, besides that, I think it's the cut. I think it's the edit itself. If you look at it, I don't think he really breaks the mirror. I think what happens is that his hand goes to the mirror and then they cut and it's a broken mirror and they put a sound effect over the cut. It works much better than really breaking the mirror. It's more shocking for some reason. Maybe because there is a little jump there. But they're filled with things like this in their films, where they took chances like that.
Wahlberg has nearly cracked. We've witnessed his private rage and frustration at losing Vicky and all she stands for. But now he pulls himself together. It was only the mirror that cracked after all, although in the supernatural world of the Red Shoes, this might yet prove to be a bad omen. For Lermontov in his operatic off-duty costumes often seems like a fairy tale figure. We can almost imagine him here as the magician whose spell has failed to work, allowing the princess to escape his clutches with her prince. Back in the everyday world, which we see very little of indeed in the Red Shoes, it turns out that Lermontov has been considering legal action against Vicky. But we learn from the lawyer that he keeps getting cold feet and deciding at the last moment not to proceed. It's strange behaviour for someone as dictatorial as Lermontov, But of course that's his problem. When he banished Vicky and Julian from the charmed circle, he damaged himself. So to take further action against them would only cause him more frustration. He's caught in a dilemma, hence the unusual indecision. We might note in passing that this particular dilemma, trying to control someone's behaviour and career by means of contracts and injunctions, is highly characteristic of the film business, probably much more so than of the ballet world, where, certainly at this time, dancers like Moira Shearer had no contracts at all. But for Hollywood independents like Selznick and Goldwyn, with whom the Archers would soon tangle, contracts were a way of life, as they were for Korda. So Lermontov is behaving more like a movie mogul than a ballet impresario. How can he break the deadlock? The first answer turns out to be a cynical return to his previous cast-off, Boronskaya. His lawyer has dined with her only the previous night and is quickly recruited as a part of Lermontov's plan. Suddenly we realize that he has a long-term strategy to create dependence. Having brutally dropped Boronskaya, he knows she'll be grateful to be accepted back. One of the most perceptive early reviews of The Red Shoes is by the Cuban novelist Cabrera Infante. He wrote it in 1957 after seeing the film again, nearly a decade after it had first excited him as a youth. One feature that struck him forcefully was its daring use of relative time. As an example of this, he compares Vicky's long drawn-out ascent of the steps up to Lermontov's villa with the return of Boronskaya. This, he notes, is told in a flash, and here is how he describes it. The impresario gets his lawyer to induce the ballerina to meet up with him. The impresario is unusually seen watching a fashion show. A lapdog barks. The impresario turns round to see the owner of the lapdog coming towards him. "Ah, my dear Boris," she exclaims. Cut to the ballerina, now dancing again her greatest success, Les Sylphides. All told in less time than Vicky has taken to climb the monumental staircase. And why this use of relative time? Seeing the whole action, as if from Lermontov's point of view, means that time adjusts to his priorities, and it reminds us of his magical powers. He decides, and they appear or disappear. Boronskaya's return is only a means to an end, which will require much more plotting and brooding. Meanwhile, life goes on in Monte Carlo. The same office, the same director, going over the box office returns, which we imagine are not quite so good since Boronskaya replaced Vicky. But Lermontov's loyal staff are also plotting. His regulars, the 2 Russians and an Englishman, believe that he's making a big mistake in banishing Julian and losing Vicky, and they don't intend to take it lying down. But previous experience has taught them that crossing Boris Lermontov directly can be dangerous. They have a strategy. They plan to feed him titbits of information from letters from the happy couple and whet his appetite. Livy, in particular, sticks to his view of Julian's talent. Livy was played by another Archer's stalwart, Esmond Knight, of whom Jack Cardiff has especially fond memories.
Esmond Knight was a fantastic person. We knew that he had been blinded, or practically blinded, on the Prince of Wales, this huge ship in the war. He was on that ship when it was bombed and attacked. He couldn't see very well. I mean, he couldn't see a few yards away, and things like his marks and things he couldn't see, but he was such a courageous person. When we were on location in the south of France, it was that sort of film where we had the holiday spirit as well. We'd say, well, there's lunch, let's have a quick swim, you know, which is unheard of. So he would say, yes, I'm coming. And we'd think, well, how can he go? We had to dive off the rocks, you know. He would jump in the water. He would be led to the rocks and feel his way to the edge and then just jump in the water. I mean, it's amazing, the courage to do a thing like that. And, of course, he had worked on Black Narcissus when he used to stride about this room, and he couldn't see the marks, but he did it. Wonderful man, wonderful sense of humour.
Livy, as we've seen, is a kind of Sir Thomas Beecham surrogate. He has the confidence of an English baronet who speaks his mind, and in the Red Shoes novel, his background is filled in with a demanding ex-wife and other Beecham-like society trappings. As with many of his other performances for the Archers, like the village eccentric in A Canterbury Tale and the Indian general in Black Narcissus, Esmond Knight's blindness almost seems to help his characterization, giving it a detachment and a clarity. The 3 plotters are pleased with their success in pricking Lermontov's curiosity. On this backstage level of the story, they're hopeful that he'll overcome his pride and find a way of bringing their star back. And indeed, if this were an ordinary backstage movie, that's precisely what would happen, leading to a triumphant final vindication of stardom, magnanimity, and general rejoicing. But it's not that kind of movie. Its roots lie further back in the romantic imagination that produced the modern fairy tale, as well as countless other stories of haunting, possession, reincarnation, and all the paraphernalia of the Gothic revival. Ironically, the founder of this tradition, E.T.A. Hoffmann, is best known today through the opera The Tales of Hoffmann, which the Archers would film soon after The Red Shoes. The real Hoffmann, on whom Offenbach drew for his opera, was a German musician and writer who lived from 1776 to 1822, right through the crucial years of the Romantic movement, which swept across Europe in the wake of the French Revolution. Hoffmann's first passion was music. He was a relatively unsuccessful composer and a critic, and in his writings he championed the then unfashionable Mozart and Weber. Many later works by the German Romantic composers pay direct or indirect tribute to Hoffmann. Schumann's piano suite, Kreisleriana, for instance, is based on themes and characters from his tales. Although music was his greatest interest, it was Hoffmann's writings that brought him fame. He pioneered a new kind of fiction. It was based on traditional folk tales, many of them children's stories, but he added to these a vein of psychology and of fantasy, and often cast them in very strange forms. In one story, for instance, we are told that occasional pages have been stolen so that there are sudden gaps in the narrative, and in another we find a Chinese box structure with characters telling stories within stories. The Nutcracker, for instance, well known from Tchaikovsky's ballet, is based on a Hoffmann story about toys coming to life. What makes Hoffmann so modern is the way he links the supernatural with the psychological. Instead of two different realms of belief, we have two ways of looking at the same events. In A New Year's Adventure, which provides the second episode of the Tales of Hoffmann, he warns the reader that he cannot separate the inner from the outer life of the characters, and so, before you are aware of it, you will be in a strange, magical realm where figures of fantasy step right into your own life. Hoffmann was the first to put into words a distinctively modern idea of the eerie, the disturbing, things that send shivers down our neck. And indeed, when Freud and his followers turned their attention to literature, they found that Hoffmann had anticipated many psychoanalytic ideas. The supernatural goings-on in his tales can often be read as wish fulfillment or as the dreaded return of the repressed. In between, so to speak, Hoffmann influenced two generations of modern Gothic writers, although few followed his eccentric forms. One follower of Hoffmann was Hans Andersen, who had wanted to be a professional dancer and an actor before he took up writing and achieved international fame with his tales. Like the Grimm brothers and Andrew Lang in Britain, Andersen was caught up in a general mid-19th century enthusiasm for folk culture. But while one side of this was scholarly, another was Hoffmannesque, dwelling on the weird poetry and gruesome imagery that's to be found in many folk tales. And it seems that many of Andersen's own frustrations found their way into his tales, as well as the puritanical Danish culture in which he'd grown up. The world of Andersen's tales is one of harsh punishments for often innocent transgressions. Those punished are often children or adolescents, and their fate on earth is seen as a necessary purification before they find peace in heaven. Not altogether surprisingly, Charles Dickens, another specialist in childhood death scenes, was a great admirer of Andersen and had him to stay when the gloomy Dane visited England at the height of his fame. Well, as the English writer Marina Warner said recently, when it comes to fairy tales, we're all post-Freudians now. In fact, it would be more accurate to say that fairy or folk tales played some part in the foundation of Freud's method, by offering examples of symptomatic texts, stories with their dreamlike symbolic meaning laid bare. So, when we start to think about Andersen's Red Shoes, we almost automatically know it's about more than those old dancing pumps. Karen, the heroine, if that's the right word, of Andersen's story, is an orphan girl whose first shoes are made from scraps of red cloth. When she's taken up by a rich lady, Karen plays on the old lady's poor eyesight to have her buy a sparkling new pair of red shoes, which she boldly and blasphemously wears to church. Soon, she thinks only of the red shoes, until a strange old soldier with a crutch puts a spell on her, and she's off on her unstoppable dancing career, which only comes to an end when she asks the executioner to cut off her feet with the shoes still dancing. He makes her some crutches, and Karen is finally forgiven and reconciled to her death. Now, it's tempting, and probably right, to say that redness and dancing have a strong sexual symbolism in this context. Remember Andersen's Little Mermaid, who wants to become human and has to have her tail cut in two? Becoming human and growing up both involve little girls coming to terms with blood and sex, although discreetly within the boundaries set by church and family. Karen, however, flaunts her womanhood in public and pays the price. She's condemned to display it constantly in what amounts to a public prostitution. Only by a bizarre form of castration, cutting off the symbols of her sexuality and womanhood, can she be accepted back, and then only on her way to a merciful death. If the Red Shoes Ballet takes only the central idea of the girl who is possessed by her desire for the shoes and cast into limbo until death releases her, then perhaps the larger structure of the film takes more from Andersen. Vicky, after all, seems to be an orphan. Lady Neston is her guardian, and she is tempted, not once but twice, to put on the red shoes, which give her power and pleasure. The film's dialogue tells us virtually nothing about Vicky. She's little more than a projection of two men's desires. But if we read across the swirling, unconscious imagery of the ballet into the few glimpses we have of her off-screen, might we not find a wider exploration of the themes that are present in Andersen's lurid text? Isn't Vicky essentially being punished for wanting to display herself in public and also to give herself in private to Julian? It's too simple to say that the film merely carries over the misogyny of Andersen. Doesn't it actually translate this into a provocative clash between two dogmatic male projections and show Vicky destroyed by their violence? The brief glimpse we get of Vicky and Julian's London flat has all the quality of a dream. Both seem to be sleepwalking when they get up in the middle of the night and communicate through music. If this is real life, then it seems less real than the hectic theatre world, and we understand, without any words, what is pulling Vicky back to the red shoes.
I don't know.
Happiness she has with Julian, but not the passion that transports her on stage. And so she's ripe for Lermontov to make his final ploy, in a neat reversal of her following him to the station. Between the Hoffmann-esque fantasy of Andersen and the art world scandal still hovering around the Ballet Russe, The Red Shoes follows a middle route and draws us into a modern melodrama such that cinema alone could create. Finding the language for this was never going to be easy, especially in the restrained, over-polite world of British filmmaking in the mid-40s. Although the scenario of The Red Shoes is a masterpiece of structure, the dialogue inevitably posed some problems. Marius Goring remembers having to do an emergency overnight rewrite of the great dressing room confrontation, which was among the last scenes to be filmed.
It was very difficult because Emmerich had become rather sentimental. And when she's just about to go on, and there's been this whole business of the breakup of the marriage, Emmerich found it rather difficult not to be sloppy about it. Well, it was really the most exciting thing of the whole thing. So as we were going through, Mickey said, "What shall I do, Marius?" And I said, "Look, do you mind if I try and write?" And they all said, "No, of course, come on, Marius, do it." And so I sat and I wrote, and then I showed them all there was a copy of it all. Suddenly I heard it, I said, "Oh, am I not allowed to read it?" Mickey, I said, "Of course not, my dear." He looked at it. He said, "It's right, absolutely right." "What do you think?" all the others said, yes, we agreed. All right, off we go. If we had actually done what Emmerich had written, it would have been sort of sloppy.
Moira Shearer had also been dreading this big dramatic scene, especially in view of her lack of previous acting experience. And even with Marius Goring's support, it proved a traumatic experience.
This big scene, so to speak, was coming where I knew I had to break down and do everything, and I thought, will I be able to do this? And especially with this very difficult relationship I had with Michael Powell. And so we got onto the set, and Michael Powell was always last to arrive, and he would come on, and then he would talk a bit with people, you know, his camera crew and Jack, people like that, and then he'd suddenly turn around on all of us and say, "Well, come along, what you all standing about for? What you all waiting for? Come along, let's start." And so we'd start, And he allowed the whole scene to go through from beginning to end. And as far as I remember, he didn't stop us at all. And of course, out of nerves, it was sheer nerves, I did the thing that no actor should do. When it got to the moment of breaking down, I did, genuinely. And the tears poured in all directions. I was so sort of caught up with doing the thing at the time that I didn't realise, that this was not a good thing, but at the same time, obviously, startled people, rather, roundabout. We got to the end of the scene, and I mopped up as well as I could and all the rest of it, and there was a terrible silence. And I blinked up and looked at Michael Powell, who had drawn his mouth in, and he looked absolutely furious. Nothing was said for ages, and I think Marius gave me a handkerchief, and I felt rather nothing was said. It was awful. It was this terrible. And then he said, well, all right, we better do that again. I mean, he said nothing one way or the other, whether it was awful, terrible, not too bad, nothing. And so we began again. Anton, as you know, was very removed from all of us and splendid and grand and his dark glasses and all that. So there was no question of him really saying anything one way or the other, but Marius sort of gave me a little squeeze on the arm and said, let's get started again.
Many things contributed to the electric tension of this scene as we know it. One, which helped set the tone, was Marius Goring's idea that his character should wear something black, as if he knew he was going to someone's funeral.
I remember a sort of feeling of despair. So I decked something black, because it was the opposite thing you would normally do down by the Mediterranean. I'd come to the end, so I'd gone back to London, and then suddenly left completely alone without her, and then suddenly deciding that I will come back. It's either this death or it's going to be mine. Death was in it.
Julian leaves, knowing he has finally lost Vicky. His opera, Cupid and Psyche, based on a Greek tragic myth, is playing on the radio, providing an ironic classical commentary on the scene. In The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, the Archers had their soldier hero attend a performance of Ulysses as he too returned from his wars. This great scene between the three principal characters and the silent movie sequence that follows mark the point where Powell had finally succeeded in, as he put it, freeing himself from naturalism. Every movement, every detail is here invested with a weight, a symbolism, a feeling of destiny unfolding. The overall effect, as Martin Scorsese says, is very un-English.
It reminds me of a combination of British and Italian films because of the emotion. Yet there's a sense of reserve, and at the same time, the emotion seems to be breaking the edges of the frame. There seems to be at times even, as I say in Red Shoes, especially the ending, where she doesn't know whether she should listen to her husband or to the impresario. And then she goes into the hall, and they have the wonderful shot of the shoes coming towards the camera, and then it cuts to her face where her eyes open wider, and then cuts back to the shoes, I think, and she runs down the spiral staircase. That's the level of emotion that I don't normally see in the British film of the period.
I'm often asked how this shot was done going down the stairway, and it was so simple that obviously she's running round and round and round, and all we did was to turn the stairway round and round so that we just craned straight down, and she appeared to be going, well, she was going round and round, but it was a weird effect, wasn't it? It was something that was, again, these simple things always look marvellous.
Jack Cardiff explaining how the whirling spiral staircase shot was made. And now Martin Scorsese brings a director's eye to the film's climax.
It appears that the shoes take her over the edge of the balcony. Do the shoes do that, or is it really her? That's never answered. It's never shown so that the audience can be off the hook and say, oh, I see, she committed suicide. It's not that simple. And it has to do with practically every frame in the movie that culminates in that moment. Everything that's built up before it has to do with the conflict between her, obviously, and Marius Goring and Anton Walbrook, and the dance itself, and the spirit of the dance taking over and her being consumed by it. Of course, a lot has been said over the years. Everybody remembers, especially when they first saw the movie, Anton Walbrook's speech at the end. That cracking hysteria. You could have a field day making fun of it and having a satire, having some fun with it. But in the meantime, it worked. It worked. It was so shocking. It took such a chance. It just seemed to overcome any obstacle. To this day, people will remember it.
Powell had planned Walbrook's last speech secretly with the actor, and it shattered everyone in the studio. It still has this effect today. Lermontov, the impresario, the magician, the father of his wandering family, is here reduced to a puppet himself, twitching as he barks out his epitaph for Vicky, his creation. Now he has become a character from one of his own ballets, Dr. Coppelius, the doll maker, except that this doll bleeds and will die. Opinion will always be divided on whether this is a justified tragic ending, or whether it's mawkish and in bad taste. Personally, I see no other way it could end. But here are the views of those you've been hearing from on this commentary.
To present the Red Shoes.
First, Moira Shearer, whose first day's shooting on the film started with her death scene, which we'll be seeing shortly.
My first day's work was covered in gore, slashed legs, with all the plastic and the blood poured in, so that it looked as if one was really in a mess, and literally popped under a genuine train, which was just in the station for I didn't know how many minutes, and I thought, French Railways, does the driver know what's going on back here? Will he start off? And have I got time with these huge wheels to nip out, if it does start? And it was rather horrid because trains were going in and out the whole time. And it did look as if a real accident had taken place. And I did look perfectly disgusting. I mean, much worse than it looked on the screen. It was rather burned out on the screen. But in actual fact, I really couldn't look down at myself. It was perfectly horrible and very realistic. And they kept having to pour more and more blood because it sort of dried up in the heat, The awful thing was that passengers started to come to the windows of these trains with white faces, looking as it went by, or if they stopped at all. At that time, 1948, one wasn't used to seeing any blood rolling around on the screen at all.
When I saw the film the first time, I never forget the ending. I'll never forget her body on the tracks and the white stockings or the white costume she had on, smudged with blood and dirt from the railroad tracks, because it didn't seem to me to be out of place with the film. Of course, they were criticized at the time as being misogynist and too violent. I don't know. To me, it seemed like the natural progression of the whole movie, and the way the blood is placed on her legs, it recalls the Red Shoes themselves. It just seems so very much in place visually with the rest of the picture. And Michael, I remember saying, he told the critics, he said, what would you like me to have done? To end it the way the real fairy tale ended, where they cut her feet off? He said, I didn't do that.
It's got a horror thing to it. It's got a sinister thing, like The Little Mermaid. It's a terrifying story. But you see, children need that. Then they love it, and they want to be, the hackles to rise and all that. And very often things are all right at the end in a great many stories, all live happily ever after and so on. But not always. But I think that's a terrific part of fairy storytelling.
It was done well. I think one or two critics said it was tomato ketchup, but it wasn't a bit like it, was it, really? It was straightforward. It wasn't overdone at all. Pity Hans Andersen never saw it. I think he would have liked it.
Well, English films down to that time weren't up to much. But The Two Archers came and brought something completely new in different ways, in their own way. And that was the sad thing, that they never got together again.
The Archers would stay together for another 8 years, until the strain of finding backing for their unconventional projects split their partnership. When The Red Shoes was shown at the Berlin Film Festival in 1988, Michael Powell sent a message to be read out. This film is a folk tale about art. It is dedicated to the proposition that art is worth dying for. The original story was written 138 years ago. You may not believe me, but I have a sneaking feeling that Hans Christian Andersen is somewhere in this theatre tonight and would join with us in our thanks to those who have sponsored this new, gorgeous colour print. I'm sure he and the Archers would enjoy this disc as well.